Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be exploring a potential 2024 presidential matchup, a three-way matchup between Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, Ron DeSantis as the Republican nominee, and in this scenario, Donald Trump losing that nomination to DeSantis, but running as an independent third-party candidate. So, this is definitely not the most likely scenario. I really would be surprised if this ends up, if this is how it ends up unfolding, but a lot of people have been talking about it because Trump has made pretty clear that he wants to be on the presidential ballot in 2024. And even if he doesn't win the Republican nomination, there's no way of guaranteeing that he wouldn't run as an independent. In fact, this kind of dynamic goes back to 2015 when famously one of the first questions that was asked at the first Republican debate in 2015, it was way back in August, Brett Baer asked the candidates on stage, all 10 of them, to make a pledge to raise their hand if they would not run as an independent third-party candidate if they did not get the nomination, and everyone agreed to the pledge except for Donald Trump. And so I think he's been open to this for a while, and he's still likely to win the GOP nomination, but let's say he doesn't. Let's just talk about a scenario in which he loses to DeSantis and runs as a third-party candidate. So we're just going to get started here and give Biden essentially all the states he won in 2020. And obviously this is because with DeSantis and Trump splitting that more conservative vote, we would likely see, Joe Biden win most states with pluralities, or most competitive states with pluralities. And I think that would obviously be very good for him. But more specifically, it would allow him to focus less on Trump or DeSantis and focus more on just, securing his coalition. So I think he would start out with 303 electoral votes essentially guaranteed. Some states would be bluer than others. Obviously, in a state like Georgia, I think we'd see DeSantis do a little better than Trump because he would likely perform well in the suburbs and maybe take away a couple votes from Biden. So, again, Biden would probably see his share of the vote decrease because with more options on the ballot, some people who, voted for him begrudgingly last time would maybe vote for DeSantis or Trump instead. So he wouldn't, I doubt that he'd get a majority of the vote in a three-way matchup in Georgia, but he would get a very significant plurality. And so that is where I stand on Georgia. North Carolina's similar. I think he'd win with 47% of the vote here. DeSantis would do very well in these exurbs, in this part of the state. But in the rural areas and in these, right-trending areas in Appalachia, I think Trump would dominate. And we would see him come in a, maybe a close third or a close second. But I think DeSantis and Trump would kind of split that vote, and Biden would win by 20 points just by getting 47%. Similar thing in Maine's 2nd district, although I think Trump would do better than DeSantis there by a good amount. And Texas, too. Texas, obviously, to me, is interesting because we saw in 2020 Biden get 46% of the vote there. It's certainly within the realm of possibility that he could get a little more than that in a three-way matchup, but I think Trump would dominate the rural areas. All these deep red counties up here, I think they'd all go for Trump. DeSantis would probably, do very well in the suburbs of Dallas, Austin, San Antonio. Then we'd also potentially see Trump doing well in the Rio Grande Valley. And I think that we would see Biden really lose a lot of votes in the South because I think some Hispanic voters would stick with Trump like they did last time. Others would vote for DeSantis, and I think Biden would really suffer in the South. But either way, he'd maintain, 45% of the vote, and he'd win Texas probably by 12 or 13. And yeah, that's what I want to do for now. I think those are the obvious Biden states. Now, let's talk about Trump, because Trump, I do think he's going to win a couple states here, even in a three-way matchup. So the first is Wyoming. Wyoming, he got 70% of the vote in, and if you assume Republicans combined for 70% in 2024 in this matchup, I think Trump wins 50%, DeSantis wins 20%, and, if Trump gets 50, he beats Biden by, at least 25. So we'll give him Wyoming. Idaho is similar. I think to a lesser extent the Dakotas, because South Dakota was a 25-point win for Trump in 2020. He got 62%. If Republicans combined for maybe 64%, I think Trump wins, maybe 2/3 of that, maybe 60% of it. And, that gets you to a spot where he would win, 40% of the vote, maybe a little more, but it would still be a 7 or 8 point victory over Biden. It would not be a landslide like Wyoming or Idaho. He'd win Nebraska's at large, I think likely. He'd win that deep red, super rural 3rd district safe. He'd win Oklahoma safe. And I think he'd, did pretty well in the Deep South. These are states that in the primary in 2016 he did very well in. A state like Alabama is very polarized. I think Biden's kind of capped at 37% of the vote, best case. I think in a three-way matchup, he'd probably get close to 34 or 35. And so if he gets 35, you have 65 split among Trump and DeSantis. I think Trump wins like 40 to 45% of it. And that's somewhere between a 5 and 10 point win. And I think that applies for most of these states down south. Similar thing, I would say, in Tennessee and Kentucky. These are states that are very Trumpy, specifically Kentucky, which I want to take a look at. He won by 26, and I think DeSantis would really not have any room to do better than Trump. I think he might, in a few of these wealthier counties up here, would perform well. But at the end of the day, that's 64% of the vote that I think they'd be splitting between them, and I think Trump wins like 45% of it, and he wins Kentucky by maybe a little less than 15, but he still wins it decisively. And so those are, I think, the Trump states. Now, where does DeSantis come in? I mean, he got the GOP nomination. He clearly had to, have outperformed at some level. But the problem for him is that he, to me, does not really fare well in any of these states. And there's one state I'll give him. It's going to be Utah, but it's going to be a narrow win in Utah. And in 2020, Trump performed poorly. He only got 58% of the vote. I think if it's any other Republican, they probably combine for close to like 62%. And if they combine for 62%, I think DeSantis takes like 35 to 40. And that gets him like a narrow win over Biden, who's probably at 35. So maybe I'll say DeSantis wins Utah by 3. But again, not great for him if he's only winning one state. He kind of gets William Howard Tafted because I believe in 1912 when William Howard Taft ran for re-election in a three-way matchup with Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, I think he only won Utah, or maybe he won a few other states, but he won Utah. And it was kind of in a sea of blue. But yeah, that's the only state I think DeSantis would win. And I think the rest of these states can be very close, except for West Virginia. I don't know why I forgot to characterize that for Trump. But, Montana and Alaska, I think Biden would win both of them. Montana, I think he'd win by a bit more because it's a state where it's left-trending enough that he could probably maintain his margin because he got 41% of the vote here in 2020. I think he'd get a similar amount in 2024. And you'd have the other 57, 58% being split among Trump and DeSantis. And I think, maybe Trump takes 35% of that, but that's still, a 5 to 6 point margin. And then Kansas and Alaska, they're a bit more conservative than Montana, I would say. All three left-trending states. But the thing with Kansas is that I think DeSantis would do really well in the suburbs and take away some votes from Biden there. So I think it would be closer. In Alaska, Trump just is a really bad candidate for Alaska in general. He only won it by 10 when he should have won it by close to 15 based on the national environment in 2020. And I would say, when we talk about this race, I would say DeSantis would probably perform better in the cities, and Trump would maybe hold his ground in the rural areas. But either way, Alaska's really weird. I don't want to be, super aggressive with it, so I'll put it in the lean Democratic column. Same with Nebraska's first district. This is a seat Trump won by 12 in 2020. If it's kind of similar to Kansas, it's suburban. I think DeSantis would do well there. But yeah. Now, Florida is interesting because I think Trump and DeSantis are both good fits for Florida. Trump in 2020 always did very well in South Florida. He won Miami, or he did 22% better in Miami-Dade than he did in 2016, and he saw similar swings all across the southern part of the state. But DeSantis actually won Miami-Dade, and so it wasn't a redder environment. He did have a lot of factors going, kind of with him to win Miami-Dade. But I still think DeSantis would do slightly better than Trump in Florida with that home state boost, especially if he managed to come out of the primary. So let's say Biden stakes at like 45% of the vote, and we see DeSantis and Trump kind of split that 55% evenly. Maybe DeSantis takes slightly more, maybe takes 30. We would still see a pretty solid victory for Joe Biden in Florida. And obviously that's it's a red state, but even in a scenario in which DeSantis and Trump are splitting the vote, Biden would still win it. And I think the rest of these states are kind of pure toss-ups. I think we'll give Biden Ohio and Iowa because they are, they're not blue states, but they are, they were within single digits in 2020. And, if I'm giving Kansas and Alaska to Biden, I feel like I have to give him Iowa and Ohio. I think Missouri and Indiana would be tilt because these are states that Biden is kind of guaranteed to have a high floor in. He'll get 39-40% of the vote in Indiana no matter what. And I think that even if you assume DeSantis, the thing with Indiana is that, and also Missouri, but Indiana specifically, is that Trump is a really good candidate for Indiana. So let's say Biden stays at 40% and Trump, of that 60%, he wins, 35 to 40% because he's doing so well, because he's just, winning 2/3, maybe even 3/4 of the vote in Indiana. He's going to be able to come close to winning it. Now, I think he still loses it just because DeSantis would probably do well in the suburbs of Indianapolis. But I don't know. I think this is kind of a state that Trump could easily win. I guess to make it interesting, I'll give him Indiana, but I want to hold Missouri to Biden. Then I think Trump wins South Carolina. South Carolina is really polarized. Biden's kind of capped the amount of votes he can get here. He's 43, maybe 42%. And DeSantis would do well on the coast, but I think Trump would still make it up in these rural areas and potentially improve in some of the urban areas like Columbia and Charleston. And so yeah, I think that's the map we'd get. Again, it's a really hard thing to predict because we don't have any polls like a three-way presidential matchup in any of these states, and so you kind of just have to guess and do some math in your head to just see how would how would the Republican votes be split. How would the Democrats manage to just run this campaign in a three-way matchup? And I think it would certainly benefit Biden, but it could, potentially hurt Democrats down ballot because we'd have supercharged Republican turnout. So, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you all in the next one.